Well, hi there. We're the Treaty Spaces Research Group from the University of Birmingham. And what we do essentially is work to insert Indigenous concerns into multiple areas of debate. And this really matters at the moment in particular, because a lot of the clean energy and um, adaptation to climate change agenda is really dependent in this kind of way on Indigenous treaties and Indigenous cooperation. And the Indigenous world is ever more significant in terms of governance. And so treaties have become ever more important. So I'm here today with my colleague, the co-I of the Treated Spaces Research Group, Professor Charles Pryor. Maybe you'd like to say hello, Charles, at this point.
Good afternoon, everybody out in television land. Thank you for taking some time this afternoon to join us, and we look forward to any questions that you have when we wrap up. And of course, you can also email us afterwards if a question occurs to you that didn't occur in this presentation. We're going to be changing, who is talking at any given moment. And we have some audio and video packages to play as part of this presentation. So get your speakers up loud so you can hear some of the things that we're going to be sharing with you today.
Yeah, we're really keen to hear what you think of our work and what your opinion is of the issues that we're going to touch upon. We're very much on a journey ourselves of learning, and we're very honored to have been able to work with the Indigenous groups and individuals that we have done. So I just want to speak initially about the large project that we're just finishing at the minute, which is called Brightening the Covenant Chain. And the slide you're seeing is some of the outputs that came from that project, where we sought to rekindle a relationship of diplomatic kinship between the British royal family and the Haudenosaunee, who are a group that straddled Canada and the northeast of the United States. And within this project, we did a series of things, including having a commissioned wampum belt. We also did soundscapes because we're very keen on broadening the historical archive to include sound and not just the written word, because that's essential to understanding the Indigenous past and future. We also did an exhibition, and we also edit with colleagues, Indigenous colleagues in the United States, an ongoing book series with Cambridge University Press. So as we go on, we're going to talk a little bit more about that project and in particular about the mapping work we did within it, and also some of the work we did with Indian residential schools survivors. Okay, should we go on to the next slide?
We sure can once I find the slide advancer deal. So who are we talking about when we talk about the Haudenosaunee? That's how they refer to themselves, and their word, this translates into the people of the Long House. It currently consists of 6 nations that are traditionally based in upstate New York, but currently the Haudenosaunee can be found across and around the Great Lakes, particularly Lake Ontario and in Wisconsin. The current community of Haudenosaunee nations numbers close to 140,000 people. This is a population that is roughly parallel to how many there were during the 18th century, which is the period that part of this project is concerned with. And we've spent an awful lot of time with these communities in various places and really learning from them. The major sort of philosophy, if you like, way of being that defines the Haudenosaunee is the Gaianashagoa, the Great Law. The Great Law is an origin story. It's a constitution. It's a set of principles for living together. It's defined by peace, by unity, and by good minds. Peace basically means that the peace is the value that is most sought. The unity of the confederacy of the five and then six nations is very, very important. Unity is intrinsic to how political relations are understood. And good minds is the really important part, and that's to say that all political decisions have to be the basis of communal deliberation, following tradition, listening to the wisdom of the elders, and understanding exactly what the best move to make is. What you see here is a condolence cane, which is being held by our dear friend Ken Maracle, who is the faith keeper of the Lower Cayuga Longhouse at Grand River in Ontario. And he's actually pointing to a series of pegs. Each peg denotes a chief. And this cane is done in a ceremony called the Ceremony of Condolence. And the part of the ceremony is called the Roll Call of the Chiefs, where they go back into their history and recite the names of the chief and a bit of their wisdom. But this is not a male-dominated political system. At the center of everything are females. Joy.
Okay, so the Haudenosaunee are organized in terms of a confederacy, and the whole confederacy is about maintaining, cherishing, and creating peace. And I think, given the reality, the geopolitical reality of the world right now, we felt especially honored to be learning more about the Great Law, because I think it has globally important lessons to teach, always has, but maybe now more than ever. The other thing about Haudenosaunee culture and the Six Nations within it is the, I suppose, kind of hidden importance of female leadership. I say hidden in the sense that it was deliberately downplayed or elided or obscured within the written record. And remember, as I said, we're talking here about oral cultures where the way that meaning is transmitted across generations is not by writing stuff down, it's by speaking it. And the human voice has significance that I think it's a challenge for us to really understand, because we're so focused on this written word and have been for so many generations. Anyway, that's one of the reasons that the all important balance relationship between male and female has been obscured within Haudenosaunee diplomacy. And one of the things that the postdoctoral research assistant within the project did was work on the whole recovery of where it can be found, the influence of clan mothers in generating peace, maintaining peace, and being decisive in terms of when war happened and when it didn't. And I think that's absolutely an area that needs further development when we, so as to get us all beyond the take me to your leader idea, that filtered down through the Western and so on. That there is female leadership. It's still strong and still there. It still really matters. And there is enshrined this idea of balance.
I think we've lost Joy there temporarily. Mahima, can you confirm that?
Yes, it looks as if her internet might have dropped briefly.
Yes, unfortunately, in these webinars, when your internet goes out, you're usually in a fairly awkward pose, and this time is not. Let me carry on here until Joy comes back. So the work that we did on the clan mothers is essentially to reveal the importance of clan mothers in this community, and clan mothers are essential. Clan mothers decide when war is going to be conducted. And most importantly, clan mothers are responsible for doing what's called standing a chief up. So when a chief is stood up in the longhouse and adopted by the community, it's the clan mother that sponsors that. And clan mothers are active in Haudenosaunee communities to this day, and are essentially a really, really important guiding force. To just keep moving on here, The next element of Haudenosaunee culture that's really, really important is the words that come before all else, the Ohondagoliodekwa, which is essentially sorry, Joy, you're back. Um, very good. I just introduced the Ohondagoliodekwa, the words that come before all else. We had an example of that in a thing that we're currently working on, where we brought the Thanksgiving address or the words that come before all else into sort of play with something else. Do you want to say a little bit more about what the Thanksgiving address is and what it means?
Yeah, it speaks to the importance of metaphor within Haudenosaunee, the Six Nations sets of cultures and clan structure, because the it's a ceremony that
Hmm.
where strangers are met metaphorically or actually at the wood's edge. So before they go into the territory of the Haudenosaunee, and they are encouraged to mentally dissolve trauma from themselves before they begin to treat or diplomatically exchange meaning with the Haudenosaunee. So they're encouraged to clear their ears so as they can hear. They're urged to wipe the tears from their eyes because of any loss they may have sustained through war or otherwise. And they're urged to become spiritually open to the practice of treating. And this is done through ceremony and through words. And I think it's a very, very spiritually and psychologically clever means of making good diplomacy happen. I think there's real lessons there. Should we go on to the kinship?
Sure. So the final concept that we're introducing you to is Ganancione, which is adding rafters. So the longhouse is a metaphorical thing. Longhouses are where Haudenosaunee nations do ceremony and do business. But the Haudenosaunee themselves are understood to be a metaphorical longhouse of six nations arranged from east to west. And the idea of adding rafters is another metaphor of adding strength to the roof of the longhouse. And we've seen wampum belts that are what are known as rafter belts, which show this. And we have been sort of exposed to this, what it means to enter into kinship relations with members of these communities. So when you meet, it is very almost ceremonial. You exchange greetings, you exchange news, you eat together, and there's a lot of preliminary discussion before you get to the business at hand. And kinship also means giving gifts and exchanging gifts, understanding the family structure, inquiring after the family, entering into the family. And we ourselves as a group sort of try and practice this by extending kinship relations with people with whom we collaborate with. So Damien Lee is part of our group at the moment, and he's a Leverhulme visiting professorship here with us at Birmingham. He's an Anishinaabe from Fort William, Ontario, working on a fabulous project on adoption. And another person I think we could mention is Amy Kraft, who is an Ojibwe lawyer based in Ottawa who works on Indigenous water governance. And we keep extending our kinship relationships with folks quite far and wide as we can.
Okay, so this Brightening the Covenant Chain project, I suppose it's dealing with the northeastern United States, and yet for most kids, the kind of indigenous people they encounter are the Western peoples. So this is an a sort of an indigenous history that people just generally don't get to see or get to think about. This is the signature of George III from a bit of research we were doing. And we were looking really at that diplomatic relationship and the kinship that developed between the royal family in Britain of the British Crown and the Haudenosaunee, and in particular the Mohawk. And this is a really old diplomatic relationship or relationship of kinship, but it's also still alive today, and it's condoled or brightened or replenished, um, not in the same way it was, but it still is, between the royal family and the Mohawk. And most people aren't aware of this, but this is one of the things we wanted to brighten or bring back to life and bring back to public consciousness, that there were these sorts of reciprocal relationships. And like a lot of Indigenous treaties, they don't die, they get uh, re-brightened or refurbished or maintained as generations come up that are minded so to do. So should we go to the next one?
Yeah, so I'll give you this is the history part of the history lesson now. How does this, very briefly, how does this relationship um, uh, come to be? The British colonies cling to the eastern seaboard in Virginia and the New England area, established, as all of you probably know, late 16th, early 17th century. And the world in which they find themselves is a world that is much more complicated than they ever expected it to be. If you go to the Ashmolean Museum in Oxford, you'll see a fantastic object called Powhatan's mantle, which is four deerskins sewn together with a series of shell circles on them and the figure of a man flanked by a deer and a wolf. Powhatan, or Wahunsonacock, was the paramount chief of Virginia, or what he called Sensicomica. And they didn't particularly want the English to be there. And what you have in Virginia and New England is effectively endemic warfare, where the colonial legislatures pass laws that say there will be war with the natives without cease or peace. The Haudenosaunee are off in the distance, and colonial writers are aware of the Mohawk, who are who protect the eastern door of the Longhouse at what a place now called Albany. So ultimately, the Haudenosaunee become aware of this colonial warfare, seeking peace, seeking to push the great law towards the newcomers. They meet the English at Albany, where they agree a number of articles of peace. And these become central to the relationship going forward. There is amity between these nations. This is not a colonial relationship. This is not a relationship of dominance. This is a relationship nation to nation, sovereign to sovereign. And that is how all Native nations across North America continue to see treaties. The image on the screen here is the Articles of 1677, which took and expanded these. And these articles really became the foundation of British diplomacy in the Northeast up until the American Revolution. In 1701, they met again at Montreal and also in Albany to agree a larger treaty, which included the Ojibwe, a treaty that was called the Dish with One Spoon. And in 1763, we have the famous Royal Proclamation issued by the Crown after the war with France, which essentially reserved everything on the west side of the Trans-Appalachian as an Indian country. So you imagine where history stops in 1763, and we need to rethink our way of looking at the map of North America. More on that in a minute. And imagine this point where the colonial extent of North America stops 250 miles in from the coast. The proclamation recognized inherent native sovereignty in land, regulated trade, and most importantly, it instructed, as did the Articles at Albany and the 1677 Articles, that anybody seated beyond a particular boundary line had to move back east. In other words, settlement was curtailed and pushed back. And then this was all solidified in 1764, where 3,000 people gathered at Niagara, not Niagara Falls, Fort Niagara, which is in northern New York, to agree the Royal Proclamation and to weave the Royal Proclamation into the sequence of covenant chain agreements to make it the official nation-to-nation relationship. Of course, what happened immediately afterwards is 1765, the Stamp Act riots break out. The attention of British officials turns to the East Coast, to places like Boston. Native diplomacy goes very much on the back burner. The native world requickens and gains its power, and then the power that comes afterwards, the United States, does engage in treaty diplomacy through the covenant chain for a brief 5 or 6 year period. But ultimately, the story turns out slightly differently. But essentially, the Haudenosaunee go to where they currently are at Grand River and Ganawage and Ganasatake around Montreal, their ancient territories. And the covenant chain relationship with the crown continues beyond 1776 and is decisive throughout the 19th century.
Wow. That was a lot of history very quickly. Brilliant.
Well,
So
thank you.
one of the things the project did was to retrieve the oral core of these treaties and revive it. And we created a series of what we call soundscapes, which are a kind of trendy thing, I suppose, within the museum world, where they're trying to bring the oral into your museum experience. And this melds with what we're doing because we're trying to bring oral history into how people comprehend what history is. So we re-recorded in the Mohawk language original diplomatic and treaty statements and simultaneously translated them so that when people go now to the American Museum in Bath, which I strongly recommend if you get a chance, you can not just see artifacts from that period, but hear contemporary faith keepers and Indigenous leaders speak the words in the place where those words had great import at the time and where they are still requiring that the British Crown lives up to those agreements. And this is also being picked up by Bloomberg Connect, so you can access it anywhere in the world, which we think is kind of cool. And we're doing more soundscaping because we really believe in the power of sound as a historical tool.
Mm. Just to add that the place where this was recorded is a place called Johnson Hall, which is in Johnstown, New York. Johnson Hall is the home of Sir William Johnson, who is the superintendent of Indian Affairs of the Northern Department. So he's the most powerful civil servant in the British imperial world. He's Irish, and he's active in this area between 1754 and his death in 1774. Johnson Hall was the hub of diplomacy and commerce in the Northeast. We'll play you a little excerpt. The speaker you'll hear is Nathan Brinklow, who is a very dear friend of ours, member of the Turtle Clan of the Mohawks of the Bay of Quinte. Now, let's I can mouse over this and make her go.
This is a speech made by Henrik in the names of the Mohawks of the Upper Castle, attended with several chiefs of each of the other nations, to the governor of New York in a private audience on the 2nd of June, which was published in the Scots magazine. Jadadego. Yungwayeno ne disaderi juanieto daidawadatko zit gazahaya. Brother, ne ganazaharege yungwandro, wadzagwadatko ne rariwakarenyes, zitano ne warahia ke Colonel Johnson's. Gwa ne wagwayena ne gahiadusula dunda gwarach Gwaki ona ne yayak ni honohonzage gonrunes. Brother, we thank you for condoling our loss, for wiping away our tears so we may speak freely. And as we do not doubt, but you have lost some of your great men and friends, we give you this string of condolence in return, that it may remove your sorrows, that we may both speak freely. This is a speech made by Henrik.
So sorry about that. I'll just pause there. Just to pick up on some of the elements that Joy mentioned, you can hear right off the bat that there is talk of condolence and loss and the uttering of the required words and the giving of wampum. So this is essentially how these interactions were structured. You hear the echo there because this was recorded in the room that William Johnson received diplomatic delegations in. So this is the first time in over 260 years in this location that those words in that language were spoken. And it was very important for us to bring these speeches back to life because of the centrality of the oral to all of these diplomatic transactions.
I gotta say, I find Johnson fascinating, you know, the idea that they had this fiefdom going and, you know, up to 300 sexual partners, some of the records suggest. And, you know, he's quite this amazing, both colonized and colonizer and go-between. He's one of those very multiply interpretable people. And yeah, amazing. Okay, we have the next one.
So this is the other major project that came out of Brightening the Covenant Chain. It's Movement in Common Worlds. We hadn't corrected this world up here yet. So essentially, what we wanted to do was to say, well, when you look at maps of the Northeast or you look at maps of the United States, you sort of know what you're looking at. The shape is instantly recognizable. And the land is cut across with borders and state boundaries that are also recognizable. So what we wanted to do is take it back to the point where those borders didn't fully exist and where people actually lived in close proximity one to the other. And that's what this map was designed to do. How we did it was to take a number of historic maps contributed by the British Library and to do what's called georectifying them. So taking them and putting them on a clean base map and making them actual size again, and then taking data points from those maps, translating it to the base map and repositioning a whole series of things. So the map animation is actually an interactive thing that you can play and in sequence, and you can also explore it. And we've got a little trailer here that shows you sort of what it looks like. All I need to do, there we go. So what you see is a story box, and then you'll be scrolling, and as you scroll, different data will appear, different quotations, and then the data from the base map will all of a sudden appear. We've changed the symbology here, but along the top of the illustration, you can see these are the stories that you use to navigate through. And we've made it thematic, and each story is sort of narrated in terms of what is going on and putting everything back in position. It also has a base map that shows you exactly where everything relates to current positions, and it also includes details from a series of historic maps that give us a sense. Now, this is where Nathan is from right here. This is Tynandega. We just zoomed in on. That's an old Indigenous map, and then there's a homeland. So you get an idea of what we're trying to represent with this animation. As it plays, Joy, do you want to pick up on the sort of the educational benefits and what we're trying to achieve with this project?
Well, we're hoping out there in teacher land that this might be of some use to you because this was our attempt at trying to make what can seem quite abstract or difficult to understand information to make it, well, interesting to digitally native kids. So we thought it'd be quite good for the GCSE level, you know, the say 10 to 18-year-old grouping, because A, it's a history that most people have never really thought about before. It's also got the kind of head tilt thing where, say, you know, somewhere like Manhattan or New York, you can click on it and see where the spiritually significant places were, where the pathways were, where the roots were back in time. And you can see how things have changed over time. And the big message of it really is that the Indigenous world has not vanished. And that's the beauty of the British Library British maps, that unlike the maps made after 1776, when, you know, it's the United States of America, the British maps, especially the metadata, the bits of information that's also there apart from what's drawn, They just show how present and powerful diplomatically and in material sense the Indigenous world was in the Northeast. Whereas American maps tend to say, you know, they've disappeared, they've vanished. That whole vanishing narrative or trope comes into play. The other thing I personally like about this visualization is you can get lost in it. You can look at villages and settlements and pathways and how people move from A to B, and then you can compare it with what's there today. And it's a thing that it is intriguing, and I think we've tried to design it so that it leads anyone really onto further study and further thinking. Is that what you had in mind for me to say?
Yeah, that works. And if I can just set up what you're going to say next about the textbook, and I think our larger aim in both of the digital projects really was to totally disrupt the narrative of American history as a sort of a frontier, if you like, that moves like a snowplow. I'm a Canadian, I would say that, from east to west, transforming everything as it goes, and leaving nothing behind. And it shows that's not the case because, I mean, a couple of years after the American Revolution, 87% of the continent is still in native hands. And the story, to understand that, really puts the story of the 19th century into heavy relief. How is it that in a century they're able to supposedly conquer the continent? But then again, that whole narrative of manifest destiny was something that we had real problems with, which is why we decided to tackle the next hill, which is, God, I'm good at segues today, which is
Thank
this.
you. So one of the things that had always bugged us, because we'd been sitting listening, and listening is mainly what you need to do to learn from the Indigenous world. We've been sitting listening for 25 years, 30 years, some of us, and yet the gap between that and what the young kids were learning was so enormous. When we looked at the GCSE that was being taught in Great Britain, it was really, the specification was still basically the old Western narrative that you'd have got with the old movies like The Searchers, which came out in 1956. So that was a story of um, very a very positive story about settlement, a story of Indigenous vanishing, and stuff that really, what bothered us is how historically inaccurate it is. Because right now, the Secretary of State for the Interior is an Indigenous woman. So how in the world did she get to be there if the story that's being told in the textbooks was true? And how can the living present and the strength of Indigenous political power that's it's still very real, particularly, maybe when you go to Alaska and places where that are you can really feel and sense Indigenous power, and maybe in ways you can't anywhere else in the United States. Um, so we really wanted to do something, and we realized that a complete rewrite was too difficult, even when we got together with um, not just AQA, but other entities that are powerful in this field. The specification sat like a great squat toad and couldn't be really messed with. But we did as much as we could to help Nicole Ridley, who is, I hope, out there somewhere listening. Hello, Nicole, if you are. But here's a picture of her, who wrote this book with us as consultants, doing our very best to provide her with the archival information and the direction of play to write what we think is a new, much more up-to-date story for GCSE level students. And we're happy with that to move the dial because we realize that change comes relatively so and we needed something we felt done quickly so that even our own children would not be learning such a very bogus and wrong history, an elderly way of understanding the world. And we wanted to get away from that triumphalist American settlement story. And we did more than just change the language because we don't really think that changing language is enough. You really need to change understanding of the environment and of how people interrelate with each other and bring more complexity inevitably to what is not a simple story of white might, you could say, which was too much what the old we felt the old GCSE was. So we were really, really pleased that the people producing these textbooks and the teachers themselves were also feeling what we were feeling, that something needed to be done, and we needed to bring modern consciousness much more into line with the available educational provision. So all praise to Nicole and the series editor, who's also here, for doing something that we think's really good for British kids, full stop.
And we're also trying to make similar interventions in my home country, Canada. But the difference there is that Canada did and does have a large First Nations population, and the history of interaction between the Canadian state and First Nations people of Canada is not very different from the United States. Canada had a West. Canada had a transcontinental railroad. Canada concluded a series of treaties which essentially pushed First Nations peoples onto reserves, and sometimes much worse.
So one of the other things the project allowed us to do was to interview survivors of the Indian residential school system in Canada. And we were really honored to be able to interview this person who's called Geronimo Henry. And he was in a place called the Mush Hole. So this is a very negative aspect, I think, of what happens when assimilation is allowed free rein. And Geronimo will speak for himself in a minute, but the Mush Hole was the kind of paradigmatic. It was the first Indian residential school where young Indian kids were taken or encouraged to be, or their parents were encouraged to put them in circumstances where that could hardly be avoided. And some unspeakable things happened in the Mush Hole. It was run, the legacy goes back to the Anglican Church. And this is a very harrowing story, and we're really pleased that that history is being looked at again, and that it's being led by the Indigenous world itself. But we're also saddened that maybe more hasn't been done to do practical redress, and in particular that rebuilding of, say, language that was lost, because language is, as we've been saying, is central to rebuilding Indigenous communities, that there hasn't been more done to give redress through building up language. But I'll let Geronimo say it better than I do.
Yeah, so my name is Geronimo Henry, and I spent 11 years at the residential school. So I went there when I was like 6 years old in 1942. And I got out of there in 1953. I was, by that time I was 17. Yeah. So we've seen a lot of stuff in those 11 years. And because other kids, there was always 75 boys and 80 girls there. So some of the kids would only stay there a couple of years, 5 years, 7 years. I remember my buddy up there, St. John's, he was in there about 6 months. Then they finally come and got him a couple months. So, but, yeah, so we, what do you call it? My mom, I mean, the reason why I got there, like my mother and father had separated. So I had a brother and 2 sisters that went there, two of them stayed home. So, and this is in the 40s, so discrimination too was bad against Native people. Like, it's harder to get a job for Native people. And because we weren't in the human race yet. I don't think we were classified as humans till about 1953 or 50, somewhere in there. Before that, I don't know, but I guess they still classified us like savages and pagans. Like a lot of people don't know all this kind of stuff that I'm talking about.
Geronimo only learned his Cayuga name from his mother after he left the mush hole. It's Atahine, which means the one who walks. All native names are action names. And his real name was Gerald, but he got rid of that name because he felt that Gerald had essentially not survived the mush hole, and he picked the name Geronimo because Geronimo to him symbolized bravery and resilience. And we spent a lot of time with him and saw him again a few months ago, and he's definitely one of the most strongest people that I've ever encountered in my life.
One of the things about the Indian residential school system was it created trauma, and then the trauma gets transferred through generations, which I think is characteristic of colonialism and the scars that it creates through violence and displacement and cultural attrition. And I think the divorce, the abrupt divorce from all the cultural methods of sustenance, so the diplomatic traditions, the spiritual traditions, all the stuff that holds up a community, being ripped out of that and put in a fairly abusive, assimilative school context. It is one of the most violent things in history, but of course there's a long history of this accompanying empire, as quite a few of us understand. Okay, shall we proceed?
Yeah, we'll end on a slightly more creative note by talking about an exhibition that Joey co-created with a very talented First Nations artist and anthropologist.
So this is one of the things that the Brightening the Covenant Chain grant allowed to happen, which was for the wonderful and very, very, very talented scholar, anthropologist, and textile artist, Dr. Celeste Petrie-Spade, was able to bring her over to Britain, and she's created an exhibition called Material Quay, very female-centered wearable fashion exhibition. And it did more than, I mean, it was very, very attractive and visually stimulating, but it also had really important lessons about the survivance of Anishinaabe culture. Celeste is Anishinaabe, but also it spoke to bigger issues like the contravention of treaties that had been established, and also the resource politics that go with contravening treaties and with displacing folk and so on. So here's a little clip of Celeste and her peoples and how she was able to bring that over. This was made at the American Museum and Gardens in Bath.
Just play about a minute and a bit of it. You can see the entire thing on our website.
My name is Celeste Petrie-Spade, and I'm an Anishinaabe clay research-based artist from Lac du Mille Lac First Nation, which is in Northwestern Ontario, Treaty 3 territory. I'm also the Queen's National Scholar in Indigenous Studies and an associate professor at Queen's University. Lac First Nation. It is a huge lake. I enjoy being back at home in my community during the summer months, fishing with my children, just watching them play in the water. We do a traditional harvesting together. We do berry picking. We pick for different medicines that we use still. And in the fall, we still do our leaf hunting camp. Sometimes people use those terms interchangeably, but again, the teaching that I've received is that when we're getting specific and talking about again specific families, communities, and that are from particular lands, we use Ojibwe when we're referring more to something broader. We're talking about Anishinaabe. Indigenous women in particular have always balanced multiple roles and responsibilities. They've been the people who have been the backbone of their communities. Women who came before me and my family, they were women who, went fishing, went moose hunting, trapped on their own. That idea of having to balance multiple roles and responsibilities is something that, Ojibwe women have always done.
Joy, concluding thoughts?
It's just nice that Celeste's career has gone enormously forward since that exhibition was made. The exhibition is now over, but there's lots of digital records of it. And the soundscapes, though, you can still go to the American Museum and Gardens in Bath and hear. And I think the museum visitors and the curator would say that they have indigenized quite a lot of their provision as a result of this project, which I think is fantastic. And a lot of it came down to Celeste educating folk in a very subtle and, in a way that we're all very appreciative of.
Mm-hmm. Just a concluding thought from me, just a reflection on the project. At the beginning of this project, I was a fairly traditional historian who went to archives and sat in archives for a long period of time, reading old printed materials and then synthesizing those into some sort of written work. And this project took me and still is taking me in different ways, different pathways, exposed to different things and different people, different ways of thinking and being. And it also taught us that sometimes, slaving a long time over a written publication is less worthwhile. Although it is worthwhile, it's less worthwhile sometimes than creating something and using your creative capacity and working with teams of people to help you do that, to create new ways of expressing this history and taking this history to multiple people, because our role as historians is to communicate as broadly as we can to a number of people, and in doing that, in a very gentle way, sort of challenge them to rethink what they think they know about the history that you're presenting them with. So this has been an immensely satisfying project, and we're so privileged to have done it and to be able to share it with you today. That's all we have for this afternoon. So we're happy to take any questions now.
Can I just say there are a series of publications that go with that project as well. One of them that won a massive award, so it's not as if we've just done all this stuff, but it is funny. I think the history profession and what constitutes history is changing, and it's no longer possible just to write impenetrable prose. You can still do that, but you gotta do more, I think.
Thank you so much, Joy and Charles, for sharing so many different threads of your project, giving us a lot of extra research that I know many of us want to go off and do shortly, and also for sort of reflecting on the nature of being a historian, some really interesting things to think about. We have just under 10 minutes for questions, so if you do have a question, please do pop that into the chat. We've had a couple of people already who've mentioned how fascinating the map that you shared was, and wondering whether it's available for us to have a look at.
Right, we're just in the we're just finishing the back end of the production of the map. And what I'm doing is chasing down some image credits, and we're moving it from the King's Digital Lab development server over to where it's going to live. There will be a launch of the map, and everybody will be invited to that. It'll be an online launch, and then it'll be available in some form as a teaching resource, so everybody can access it. Yep.
Fantastic. Perhaps we can ask you to share the link with us for the launch, and we'll share that out to HA members to have a look at.
That'd be great.
Yeah, so I'll just say that making maps like this is phenomenally expensive. And I just want to praise Professor Pryor for all the hard work that went into it. The rest of the team did our bits, but he led on it, and I think it's going to be of abiding value. Not least, just one of the layers is the place names, renaming them with all the metadata from the British Library maps. So all the places you think have Indigenous names, and you can find them, which I think is an amazing, just that alone. And that's before you go into how guns moved and people moved and all the rest of it.
We have a question from Ilona asking if you might be able to suggest any resources or first-hand accounts of First Nations childhood, and particularly in Canada, Ilona mentions, and how children were brought up and educated in their communities before residential schools, or perhaps those who avoided being forced into them. And that's particularly in relation to the primary school curriculum that Profs mentioned.
So you want stuff just about children?
If you have any suggestions?
I'd need to give that a bit of thought. I mean, there is a famous there's an oeuvre, I know Joseph Bruchac, Bruchac. He wrote a lot of stuff in that bracket, but there is a problem because, a lot of Indigenous diplomacy and the creation stories, the stories to live by, got devalued and called folklore, and that got devalued and called children's books. So there's a whole genre of writing that is kind of kidifying what is quite sophisticated diplomacy. So you could start there, but I think if you as a teacher are wanting to begin on all of this, it's going to sound weird, but a book written in 1979 called The White Man's Indian is probably still the single best book explaining how we ended up with such a bogus idea of the Indigenous past, present, and future. It's called The White Man's Indian, and it's by Robert Burkhofer. So I would start with that so as you know what you're looking for. And then maybe email me and I'll give that some more thought to who I would recommend. It depends if you want something from the Northeast or the West, or because, it's a bit like saying, can you tell me a European children's book from 1500? Well, do you want an Italian one? Do you want an Irish one? You know what I mean? It's a big question. And if you want something that's representative, you're not going to find it. So the big message is why I'm saying read Burkhofer, is that the Indigenous world is as diverse, as different, as warlike, as peace-like, as the European, as any other continent. So Charles, do you have ideas about books about?
Yeah, right off the bat would be Tom Porter's book, Things My Grandmother Told Me. Tom Porter is a Mohawk elder who we had the pleasure to meet and record and work with. And he compiled a whole series of things that he was taught as a child, wisdom from his grandmother. So that's a good one. Yep.
Yeah, and that is actually very readable. I'll put a link to it in the chat.
Yeah. I would suggest Googling him. He's all over YouTube. He's a phenomenally good speaker. And we have a recording of him on our website explaining Haudenosaunee custom. He's a brilliant teacher.
And we're not related.
No.
Oh, we don't know actually.
Eh,
But there's obviously you
there's
know,
quite a few porters over there.
there's a lot of porters in Mohawk and Haudenosaunee country.
Yeah.
Thank you very much. A few thank yous and other requests for books, which I think you've responded to already. I wonder if we could sort of conclude. We've still got a couple of minutes left, but if I could ask you a little bit about your forthcoming project on historic houses and the National Trust.
So glad you asked that because that's a fabulous project and it's really well funded. It's like 1.49 million and it involves a whole bunch of global universities. But it all comes down to essentially we used to go to historic houses and think, this is boring. And we thought, how could we, and we would come across things like Haudenosaunee Calomets and war clubs and and various other things that we knew were indigenous, but that were either uncatalogued or badly presented. And then we realized that there was lots of other things from the indigenous and non-indigenous world that were in historic houses that weren't presented or understood. So this project's aim is to look at historic houses differently, make them unfamiliar in a way, and say, what if we were to present them as sites of global intersection, as global crossroads, rather than the way they're normally presented, which is as family houses? And sometimes they're presented just in terms of the place as the region. Now, the two places we chose to do this work were really important to me because I'm from Northern Ireland. We also have a history of contested land and colonization, and historic houses, particularly the National Trust House we're working with, and we're also working with another house that was in the Guinness family. These places had been sites of real contestation, and conflict. So we wanted to look at whether we could globalize them, globalize their curation, their presentation, and their activities, and not just the houses, but also the environs, the thousands of acres that often surround them. And we wondered if we could do that. And then we're also using choice modeling, which is an econometric technique to see whether it will work and whether that new approach could be bled out across the National Trust or across heritage more generally. So we wanted to not just do stuff, but test its valency, its capability for expansion. So we are launching our new web pages. Go to treatiedspaces.com for that in the next month. And you can see all the folk who are involved from Queen's University and Singapore, and we're working with folk in Burma and all over the world, and also Indigenous folk to help us better understand our heritage and see it in more global contexts. I don't know if that sums it up, Charles. It's a massive project with lots of moving parts, but that's the gist.
I agree.
There
That's
you
about
go.
it.
And the other, being us, we're really keen on having as many ways the public can get involved as possible. So if you've ever thought about heritage or thought about how we can keep our heritage alive, think about ways you could connect. We're going to be doing lots of events and talks and getting fascinating people to speak. And I'd really love it if as many people as possible connected with the project, and we'll be pushing it out on our social media systems, and we'll be putting stuff on our YouTube channel. And I think almost inevitably it might be of value to teachers because we're bringing 4,000 local school kids because we love kids and we love education at all levels, and we're bringing them on site and getting their ideas and thoughts about whether globalizing these spaces is a smart idea.
That sounds fantastic. Thank you so much. And we've had comments asking if the links in the websites could be sent around afterwards. I'll send around a link to the Treated Spaces Research Group website along with the recording so that everyone can go and access it. And they can see some links in the chat as well. And Charles has also very kindly recommended a few books in case anyone wants to do some further reading. So if you're not looking at the chat, I do recommend it, and that will be alongside the recording. I think we're just about out of time for today. Huge thank you to everyone who's taken part in today's webinar. I hope you found it as interesting and insightful as I have, and I'm sure you're off to go and do a bit more digging and research now. And a particular thank you to Professor Charles Pryor and Professor Joy Porter for sharing your expertise and the richness of your research with us.